Hey everyone. So this is the overview video for the rhythm and repetition project that we worked on. This was the project we started after completing the golden ratio and the phi grid, basically the structural exercise that came after our emphasis project. We moved into now rhythm and repetition, which is a more specific kind of consideration when it comes to leading the viewer around the composition where we intend them to go. Whereas the golden ratio, the phi grid lays up the structure, basically creates the environment to which things can happen dynamically. Rhythm, repetition, these things establish more of an emotive quality. They can establish the speed and the rate in which movement happens. They can set up a comparison and contrast. They can establish a building sort of feeling. We studied three different types of rhythms. We studied the alternate rhythm or alternating rhythm. This is where we have two similar elements, and they tend to be repeating themselves next to one another, usually in groups of twos or pairs. And really what an alternating rhythm does is it creates a comparative presentation of what it is that you're looking at. So we used the example of the two figures who were sitting out looking over the lake. They were sitting on the bench and they had two bicycles next to them on the other side. They were not identical, but they represented two people, two bicycles. And so what this was creating was this alternating rhythm between the two people and the two bicycles. And so what that did is it created this comparative sort of setup. Our eye was moving back and forth, and what it does is it allows the viewer to start to notice some of the subtle differences between those two items, which are meant to be, or at least at first presented as equal. Alternating rhythm also appears to be unending. So in other words, it is the kind of repetition that is even and ongoing. So it's sort of like a clock. If it were an audio, it's sort of a tick tock, tick tock, tick tock, right? And it goes back and forth and back and forth. And one would presume that is going to continue in that regular rhythm throughout. Meaning that if we have an alternating rhythm that's moving 1 2 1 2 1 2, and it moves off the composition, that the viewer will pick up on that and just presume that repetition is happening, even if you can't see it. This is basically where you start to identify those things that are out of the frame, which is a very powerful thing to use. So alternating rhythm is one of those things that we can create. It creates a very harmonious and balanced feel. The another one of the rhythms that we worked on was the progressive rhythm, which is the building or descending rhythm. That is where we still have similar or like objects. And what we did with those is we looked for ways in which we can arrange our compositions to set them up on a progressively building a rhythm. And that would be where we have an object and then we have another object, and then the next object, which is similar to that, would be slightly farther away, and then the next object's that would be similar to that would be even farther away. So you start off with things that are close to each other, and then the next one, they're a little bit farther away, and the next one, they're a little bit farther away. And what it will do is it creates this movement that the viewer will pick up on, and they'll notice, they'll start where there's the highest tension in this in that rhythm, which is where things are closest. That's going to create the most tension in a composition. When things are very close together, even just when I'm holding my hands like that, that creates more tension than if I had my hands farther away. You can just visualize that right here versus here, which has more tension between them. And so when things are closer, they have more tension. The eye is going to go there first. Then it's going to progressively follow that rhythm as it gets larger and less tense. The same will happen if it's de-escalating. I mean, either way, the viewer is going to be looking for that rhythm to follow. You can get a lot of mileage out of the progressive rhythm, because what it does is it leads the viewer directly to a point, rather than the alternating rhythm, which is very even and very consistent. The progressive rhythm tends to begin somewhere. It tends to lead the viewer into the composition somewhere, and then moves that viewer's gaze to a place. So you can really start to use that to your advantage to move someone to it. Alternating rhythm, progressive rhythm also can help you to establish what we would kind of use, we would call atmospheric depth. So within a two-dimensional space, which we're looking at in a photograph, which is just a two-dimensional surface, we want the illusion that things are deep into space, like, me and then this flower behind me. We just presume that this flower is, behind me, but for all intents and purposes, it's right next to my head, right? This is right here next to my head. So who's to say that this isn't right next to my head, that I am not holding it up with my finger right now, right? Who's to say that? Well, when you use an alternating rhythm, or you use leading lines, what it does is it draws the viewer's gaze back, and it allows that viewer to perceive something as being farther away. So even if I were to just do this with my arm and aim it like this, what I'm doing now is I'm creating a line which is leading you backward to this object, right? This diagonal line, which is not really a rhythm, but it's more of a line direction. But what it's going to do is it's going to establish the idea that this is farther away, right? Because you're getting a perspective of my arm, which you're presuming is straight, but now you're seeing it farther away. So now you're getting the sense that that is farther away, as opposed to this, which looks like it's right up next to me. Farther away, right? It looks much farther away when I do that, right? Because I'm leading you away, but then I do this, and it's a pretty cool thing. It flattens the thing out. So alternating rhythm can set you up to create that atmospheric depth, or you can use it in reverse, or use progressive rhythm creates the depth, and the alternating rhythm will create that flattening pattern. The last one we used is more of an organic type of rhythm, which we've been calling the undulating rhythm. An undulating rhythm is the kind of rhythm you would get from like the folds of this cloth, right? You got this rhythm, and it tends to be somewhat of a mixture of alternating and perhaps of progressive. You may have a pattern within a pattern, that kind of thing, but we tend to identify that when we see very sort of unorganized or perhaps regular patterns. Even the progressive rhythm, even though it changes, it still is relatively regular, meaning it changes, but we can predict it in a regular way. But undulating is sort of this rhythm that is kind of moving. We can establish it, but it's hard to predict where the next one naturally would be. All of these rhythms that we explored, the goal here is to be able to identify them when we see them. It's another tool to be able to use in order to communicate the things that are important to us. We don't want you to be always thinking about these things. The idea isn't to go out with the intent is I'm going to communicate rhythm. That's not really what we're aiming at. What we're aiming at is rhythm is a tool for communicating. It's a way in which we communicate. It's sort of like using adverbs and adjectives. It's a way to highlight certain things within our sentence. Here, it's a way to highlight certain things in our composition being the sentence being what we mean, hopefully inside of it, what we mean to communicate. When we're talking about visual communication, composition is the grammar. And so what we mean to communicate is what's important to us. We know that. That is the rule that we've been working on. That's the basic theory is everything we always want to communicate, all the subject matter doesn't matter unless it leads us to what we want to communicate. And the composition leads us to what we want to communicate. And so what we want to communicate 100% of the time is going to be what is important to us, right? This is important. Every time we establish something like that, and we show an image, we are communicating this is important. The unique part of that statement is this. So you're establishing what is this in the sentence. That changes. That's the sort of personal part of it. Whatever that this is, that's the sort of topic that you're working with. Is important is the universal. We all just presume that. So what we're doing is we're taking something very tangible like the structure of rhythm, and we're using it to apply it to something much more existential or something that is much more about sort of communicating our emotions and communicating something that will generate an emotive response from our viewer. So I'm going to be going through your images, kind of giving you the observational feedback that we've offered you in the other projects. So this video will serve as the sort of overview, and you'll be looking for your individual projects with your names there in the channel. All right, we'll see you later. Bye-bye now.